Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats have a plan to turn America into a one-party state. Their plan has a legislative name. It's called H.R. 1, or Bill number 1. And the name itself is kind of telling. You can see how important it is to them. It's like their first priority. Now, the reason it's their first priority is that elections are obviously a critical process to determining who should rule in a democracy. And the Democrats have a scheme to try to make sure that they're ruling all the time, that the opposition in America becomes a kind of token force. Now, this may seem unprecedented, but in American history, we've had periods where one party has completely dominated. The Democrats have had two clear periods of domination, from the 1820s, when Andrew Jackson was elected in 1828, I believe, for about 40 years until the Civil War, and then from 1932, FDR, until 1980, when Reagan brought a stop to all that. And the Democrats would like to see an era like that again, where they are firmly, you may say, in the saddle. Now, this H.R. 1 is a terrible bill because of the way in which it tries to rig the process at every stage, and they've thought of everything. There's a little summary of it. I'll be going into more detail over time as the bill, which has passed the House very narrowly, without Republican support. The Democrats were wholly behind it. The Republicans were wholly against it. And its fate in the Senate is a little more problematic. The Senate, of course, has the powerful tool of the filibuster, not to mention that it's 50-50 in the Senate. So it doesn't look like this bill will survive the Senate. But the Democrats are fanatical about this. They want to overrule the process. They want to end the filibuster. They want to get this through by hook or by crook. And why is it so important to them? Well, here are some of the things that this bill would do. And this is a little summary by Representative Elise Stefanik of New York. She goes, H.R. 1 would use taxpayer money to fund campaigns. So right away, there's the money injected in the process. Number 2, ban voter ID. This is a big one for the Democrats. Ban voter ID. Number 3, prevent the removal of ineligible voters from the registration rolls. So in other words, the simple process of cleaning up the rolls. Number 4, they're opening a pathway for felons and minors to vote. In fact, I saw Ayanna Pressley the other day talking about letting 16-year-olds vote. Allow 15 days of early voting, which means kind of the end of Election Day. The elections now suddenly become a more amorphous process, and one that's very difficult to control to make sure that only eligible voters are voting. Accept absentee ballots 10 days after Election Day. Wow. So the processes that were flatly illegal in Pennsylvania, the 3-day extension for voting, now becomes a 10-day extension. And finally, legalize ballot harvesting. Remember, ballot harvesting was the device used in California, essentially to swing even Republican districts into the Democratic camp. Last-minute votes found in somebody's Volkswagen. Oh, that tips the election. There we go. Sorry, the Republican who was announced to be the winner is not the winner anymore. So it's almost like they've got a California formula. They've turned California into a one-party state, and now they want to turn America into a one-party state. Now, the first thing I want to say is that, the government normally doesn't function like this. The government normally is very careful to make sure that they identify you correctly. And so if you look at all these government processes, let's take, for example, the IRS. Don't they make sure that taxpayers are properly identified? You've got your proper tax ID number. If you're undergoing an audit, that they've got the right, they ask you for all kinds of information. Not just the IRS. Look at all the loans that they've been making for the PPE loans for COVID. If you apply for a PPP loan, you have to submit all kinds of documentation, all kinds of authentication, all kinds of financial records. And this is true throughout the government. If you go in for any kinds of government documents, they check you out, they want your ID, they match one ID against another. We have verifiable procedures throughout this country to make sure that the right people are counted, and if benefits are flowing, they go to the person who deserves it. But not here. Suddenly, when it comes to voting, which is the cornerstone of our democracy, suddenly all these procedures go out the window. And this can't be because the government is so incompetent. No, they're actually pretty competent in other areas. They're pretty competent, for example, in collecting the money you owe them. They're pretty careful when they're giving you any kind of money. But somehow when it comes to who should rule, the Democrats drop all these procedures. Now, what's interesting is they don't say that that's what they're doing. In fact, they act like they are working to correct abuses. Here's a fascinating article in The Atlantic by Ronald Brownstein, one of the sort of absolute bootlickers of the left. And you can kind of count on him to sort of give you the party line. Now, Ron Brownstein understands the stakes. One of his key lines is no exaggeration to say that future Americans could view the resolution of this struggle as a turning point in the history of U.S. democracy. He's right. It's a turning point. You know why? Because in a sense, what the Democrats are trying to do is end the normal democratic process of accurate counting of authenticated voters. They want to go ultimately to a system in which is stacked in their favor. But that's not what Ron Brownstein says. He says the opposite. To many civil rights advocates and democracy scholars I've spoken with, he says that the federal law is required to overturn state bills, which, quote, constitute the greatest assault on Americans' right to vote since Jim Crow era battles. So basically, here's what's happening. In a lot of the swing states, Republican legislatures are actually moving to correct voter abuse, fraud, irregularities, to, in a sense, you may say, streamline the system and make sure it's accurate. So in Georgia, Texas, Arizona, Iowa, Montana, many places you have Republican governors, Republican legislatures saying, listen, there were a lot of shenanigans that happened this one time. They happened maybe because of COVID. There were all kinds of circumstances, but we're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. And it is precisely these efforts to clean up the process, to remove the abuses that the Democrats view as a threat. What they want to do is take these abuses, systematize them, and make them, if you will, permanent. So there's a lot riding on this. In a sense, the integrity of elections itself is riding on it. The Democrats know it. The Republicans know it. In the end, I think this is not going to come down to a reasonable argument over what is the best way to count votes in a democracy. You would like it to be an argument about that. But it's like the immigration debate. The immigration debate isn't really about let's try to figure out that the right people get in, that true humanitarian standards are applied, they're applied even-handed. No, it's not about that. It's how the Democrats simply want to get people across the border. They don't care if they're MS-13 or coyotes or whatever, because to them it's new voters. To them it's essentially the same thing. Let's try to make sure we have a permanent majority. That's one way to do it. This is another way to do it. H.R. 1, it's their top priority, because if they can fix the process, then they can make sure that they are permanently in the saddle.